Here we go, here we go, here we go now. It is time for the Medtech Business Academy. My name is Mike Sperduti, and I am joined with Thomas Hickey. And today, we are normally joined by Barbara, and Barbara's an expert on our panel, but today, we're going to change it up a little bit, and we're going to talk to Barbara about what she does arguably better than anybody else. She is industry renowned for it. Some people call her the godmother of this particular part of the business. Some people call her king, queen, but she is the authority from what we know. And we're going to be talking about value analysis. So we have an actual expert panelist, and we are very excited. This is the Medtech Business Academy. Well, Barbara, we are absolutely thrilled to be talking to you today. I know I am, and I know Tom, we just like talking about this stuff. And I know our audience is really probably interested about value analysis, because as an executive in this space, I hear the term, but quite honestly, and maybe embarrassingly, I haven't used it. So I think we should start with, number one, are you putting value on my company? Like, what is value analysis?
Spoken like a true executive for a company, Mike. What is it? And what is on that? Getting value? And these days we kind of say before COVID and after COVID, that whole equation and what we're all doing and stuff has changed. People might remember us from way back in the day and consider us the no committee or the slow committee or what is this stuff and things. And by the way, I love the intro and thank you so much. I was introduced to someone once as the grandmother, and the person was probably, I could have been his grandmother. And that was like, ah! So I'm glad I'm at least a godmother here. So thank you very much. It's really interesting how it's changed a lot, but also how it's stayed the same. It's a profession. It's not just a thing or something that was just thought about and somebody just sort of invented something. I mean, it goes back a long way. And people have heard me kind of on the sort of the chicken circuit talking about value analysis and what it is. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what they have to understand is what's going on in the provider world today. And there is more emphasis on value analysis, meaning the whole organization from the provider point of view, whether it's an IDN or whatever, is very vested in it because it's a way to really vet products, services, either clinical, non-clinical, across the board, because we do it in a certain way that we're going to get to an evidence-based decision, not just having hundreds of requests come in and all of a sudden we've got money going out the door. And are we even using these products? Is it someone saw something and said, ooh, I would really like that, versus what do we really need in this day and age to close those gaps to quality? And total value is what we're looking at, because we're trying to switch to outpatient. We're trying to do a variety of things because we learned from COVID, you can't just put all your eggs in the big, tall hospital building.
So when I hire you and I go through this value analysis, what does the outcome of your work look like? And what are the benefits that I'm going to receive?
So in my consulting business, after I retired after 40 years in Providerville, as I call it, I really focus it on what's your message? How is it going to be received? And how much value are you possibly going to bring? So we're past the stage of, I've got the best product in the universe in this niche, and I don't know why someone wouldn't buy it. Well, they might have the right infrastructure. They might not be in the right geography, the right patient mix. They may not be in the right reimbursement categories. They might not have the right physicians or laboratories or things set up. So value analysis in an organization, no matter how small or big, understands that. And so when they come to make a proposal, then they're going to want to know all about that organization, and they have to be educated, meaning that supplier and whatever it is they're trying to bring in, because it's got to be a match. It can't just be sort of a match and we take a scissor and cut it and see if the piece fits in. So I help them to understand that market and what's really needed in that market and how we can really develop their message in a short, digestible fashion that can be understood and get to the next step of that process if that product or service meets what that organization needs.
So, Tom, I'm really interested because you work with Barbara on many different clients, and from your perspective, because you're helping these, device manufacturers. A lot of folks in our audience would go to you because you help them commercialize, right? So, when you work with Barbara, what do you see from your perspective, the value when she does it, and what is the value when people don't do it? Like, what's the consequence of not doing it?
Yeah, I love that question because Barbara and I have worked together on a number of projects, and we've seen a number of companies sometimes try to shortcut this process, right? And it's the old axiom of, speed to market, and I got to get there, I got to get there. And it's like that old statement of, well, if you don't have time to do it right the first time, when are you going to have time to redo it the second, right? So in many ways, I think working with Barbara and teasing out what's the real value. And it can be a little bit of a challenging process at times because you're really doing a deep dive. But at the end of the day, Mike, it really can save you time. And a lot of times, and Barbara probably can articulate this better than I can, but I found working with her, it's not about price. It's about value. And where this really helps an innovator and an early stage company that may not have the big brand name yet, but if they can articulate the value and what that's going to mean, that really can help their sales team and their marketing team reach people in a different way of going, this is going to be the outcome. And Barbara, maybe I can toss it to you. I mean, in terms of how you dig into that value, quotient and that equation, so it's not all about price. Can you help us with that?
Sure. The way we generally look at it, and this is why I tell anybody in the industry, if you can remember that value equals outcomes divided by cost, whatever that quality is, that patient outcome, the one outcome from a product, a service. If you're doing services better, it can be one product, it could be a suite of products, it could be a whole, a replacement of equipment, whatever it is. But you're probably not, an organization such as a big hospital or IDN probably isn't doing everything so well that they have the best quality in the universe. And it depends on how big their gap is in that quality and how much a product or whatever can close that gap. And so there's costs associated with poorer quality, and there's costs associated with doing better quality. And you just want the right side of that equation to occur to have total value. And what's important in the work is I deep dive into everything is like, who are the key stakeholders for this product? But who are the other secondary, tertiary, et cetera, stakeholders that have to interact with all of this? Is like if somebody has a product and it's only used in a certain area, but it means that you have to change your radiology approach or new lab tests or what even environmental services might have to do, or waste or sustainability or what. So I dig into every layer. So what I always tell clients is you want to position yourself so that they don't stop you right away and say, but what about, what about? You're answering the question so they understand you know what you're talking about And then you can carry on a better conversation.
And Mike, let me give you, Barbara and I worked on a client together that I think is really relevant to this discussion. It's a company called Small Tap, and they developed a positioner for doing infant lumbar punctures. And the lumbar puncture has been up to this point for about the last 40 years has been done the same way, where they take the child, you can imagine this, a 2-month-old child, and scrunch them up with their head between their knees, laying sideways on a table, and a kid screaming and kicking. You've got a nurse trying to hold this child, and then you've got a practitioner trying to take a spinal needle and get it in there between L3 and L4 with like a moving dartboard while you're trying to throw the dart. Well, this company developed a positioner that would hold the child steady, and their outcomes were showing that they were enhancing first stick success rates by like 50%. But it was, fairly expensive, right? Because of the way you're doing it before, you're just holding this child. Now you're buying a piece of $2,400 or so piece of equipment. You've got some straps involved, some disposables. But if you can enhance your outcomes by 50%, you were saving on admissions. You were letting nurses go back to working at the top of their practice versus spending a half an hour, 45 minutes holding this child, right? And then maybe being successful, maybe not. Very stressful on that nurse too. And then, it's better for the families, because if you get that stick, the families are going home, right? A half hour, an hour later, whatever. And then Barbara did an outstanding job of boiling all that down in terms of what does that mean in terms of that outcome and that cost.
Fantastic. And one of the things I'm thinking, and that's a really good example, is how much of value analysis is clinical versus the financial value, and how do you make that determination?
Well, you don't, the project itself is what makes the determination. If you've got a me too, and you try to figure out what does this one have over this one, when it looks like a me too, but there might be one key factor that no one else has, but no one's been able to pull that out as a key thing that would prevent, a variety of other things from having to be done. So it eliminates waste in processes and things. Then it becomes more of a dollar and cent conversation, because you can compute what's the current waste in all of that. So you have to have a clear enough vision of what currently happens today and what would happen in that future state should this be adopted. And it's what I try to tell people to do is take a chance on listening and learning about a variety of products and a variety of providers, because by training each other in what's really going on, you can make a sort of a cross somewhere and say, we never thought about it that way, and this will help solve that problem. But there's so much going on every single day, it's hard to take that deep breath and learn about those things. That's why suppliers really need to focus on short, accurate, to the point, and do a lot of homework ahead of time.
And so would you say that all products, or what percentage of products go through a committee versus a sole decision maker?
So I'm very prejudiced, because the way we transitioned over 20 years was to the first part is we did a whole executive steering committee at the executive level of the organization. So the whole concept permeated throughout everything, whether it was cancer center, inpatient, ambulatory clinics, whatever it was, you participated, because everybody figured out it took about 2 to 3 years. This really works. So we didn't have individual decision makers. Now, there might be an ultimate executive, like if you were going to onboard a new EMR, for the whole health system, or if you were going to bring in a whole new set of services, or change wholesale a variety of things, but they base it on the same premises of value analysis. I need, the data, what's currently happening, analyze all of that, and then let's have the right people at the table to make like the initial decision, and then the final decision would be based on, is it $12 million or $25 million? What did it really show us? When do we get the return on investment? And then they make that final decision depending on how big it is. But most is done by some sort of either established committee, like there might be always an OR committee, or there might be always a radiology committee, or we put together a lot of ad hoc groups if it was just orthopedic implants, or if it was just neurosurgery implants, or it was just this or that. So there's all kinds of different ways to do it, but you use the same thought process.
Interesting. And Tom,
Mike,
I know. Well, actually, I wanted to ask you a question, Tom, if I could, relative to, because I know that you're a genius relative to helping companies with sales and taking this information and then monetizing it, right? So can you just talk about how you use Barbara's information in the world of sales and the value of that again, and the value of, or the consequence of not having it?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And it actually builds on what Barbara was talking about a little bit, in the sense of, there's very few that I can think of anymore single decision makers in anything, even what you might think of the most simplest commodity types of products, right? Because anymore with the integrated healthcare delivery system, even a Band-Aid, right, can have an impact, because it might be that provider at the family practice, but supply chain has to think about, all right, how do we get that Band-Aid in, right? Where's it coming from? What's my distribution channel with this look like? What SKUs are involved? Is it hypoallergenic, or is there latex, or is it for certain applications? So you start spinning into all these different aspects of what is going to be the impact of just simply moving this little Band-Aid from wherever it's manufactured into the end user, right? So from a sales perspective, if you can have a pretty good handle, and I just say even a pretty good handle on it, it doesn't have to be perfect all the time, but the value analysis team can look at it and go, okay, here's a company that's done their homework. So Mike, from your sales experience, it really helps when the customer can look at your information and go, here's somebody that's done their homework. And if you've done your homework, therefore I can trust you.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you're building that trust because, you've done your homework, and it doesn't have to be a double-blind clinical study with 250,000 patients. It can be sometimes just as simple as a couple of white papers and a few experts, key opinion leaders that have used the product and have provided some sort of testimonial. So back to your question, what I've seen is if the companies would take the time to put this documentation together, arm their sales reps, put those arrows in their quiver when they go and present their information. And a lot of times they have a hard time even getting to that committee. But if you can arm your sponsor, whether that's a clinician or whomever, with that information that they can then take to that committee and go, well, here's what the company provided. And somebody like Barbara looks at this and goes, well, that's at least a B+ worth of work. Right. I'm feeling pretty good about this. It puts the company much further ahead in that whole process versus, we work with companies that try not to do this, and we're not going to go into names here, but we've worked with a few that think, well, we're smarter. Because we're invented by, this engineer or this doctor or whom have you, and they come in and they fall flat on their face. Because they don't have that information. They've got this, well, we invented this attitude and therefore it must be, and it doesn't gain traction. And then they start wondering why. So it's a huge time saver. If you make that investment up front, you can ferret out all those little aspects of what's going to make a health system sit up and take notice, gain that credibility, gain that trust. It'll eventually, the return on investment of time and outcome and revenue will really help the company.
Yeah, and
I
I
have,
think,
oh,
go ahead, keep going.
I was going to say, I have one little tiny, just to exemplify what Tom was saying is we did all of our due diligence on changing out a whole product line having to do with wound care, which is a mind-numbing process in itself, right? So we got all the way to the end of the process. We're just going to implement it, and because we've done all the education and things. And for a number of years, I also directed supply chain operations, which has to do with bringing in all that inventory and the dock and stuff in our Kanban system bins or whatever it is. So the product came in and they went to put it in our Kanban, and it, was in a box, and there were so many in a box. And so we could do it by the each. So we took it out, and none of the product on the inside was labeled with the important information you needed. It was only on the box. And the supplier said, well, yeah, there's no problem in that. I go, excuse me, we have regulations and stuff. How are we going to do expiration dates and stuff? So we implemented, so you learn along the way, but everybody has to look through every aspect, because if it's going to disrupt the whole clinical integration piece with supply chain and all that sort of thing, it might be just we can't do it because you've made it impossible to implement in every situation.
Yeah, it's funny to mention that, because as you were talking, I was just thinking about the switching costs of going from one thing to another, and the training costs. And so that must be a big part of the value analysis.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. I've actually calculated cost of conversion, and we include that in there.
That's awesome.
And we try to make those costs go away depending on what they are. And we try to have the new company probably try to absorb some of those, or the old company needs to help do this and that. But sometimes you're left with an overwhelming amount of either product or the way you've done business. Now you have to rearrange spatially. I mean, a variety of things. And sometimes we just can't implement it because it just changes everything too much.
And I might add to that, we've actually seen some companies become very innovative with that, incorporating organizations like our friends at the Clinician Exchange, for instance, where they can have clinical educators and or look at other types of learning modalities. And it's fun to watch companies when they work with Barbara and all of a sudden they go, oh, you mean that's an issue? And then they start innovating themselves about, well, we could do this to help that process. And that's some of the positive aspects of this, is they start to build that clinical library or that educational library or what have you, because now they're thinking about how can I serve my customer? And that, with that mindset of embracing that and trying to create new ways to approach it, also helps the companies, and it creates a win-win for the hospital system and the company themselves.
Interesting. So I bet there's a bunch of folks listening to this, and they're frustrated. They have what they believe is a great product. It solves a need. They know it does because they, in their heart, they know it. And it's true. And let's just assume that it is true, but they're not selling, right? Because they're not telling the story or the value proposition the right way. And so, Tom, have you ever run into that? And is that the time, like even, maybe you should have done value analysis when you first started, but is there ever a bad time to do value analysis?
Well, there's never really a bad time to do it, but I think the biggest example I can think of is what Barbara and I call the coming to America story, where we see some offshore companies that have some amazingly well engineered products. And they think, boy, we've done really well in fill in the blank country here, Western Europe, Asia, what have you, and we're going to take the US by storm. And they just don't realize how complex the US healthcare market really is. And, you've got to tap the brakes. You got to think about this. So that's one example of it. And then a lot of times we also run into, I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's that engineer or that clinician, like a surgeon that's like, well, I've used this and all my colleagues say, this would be great, but all their colleagues, work in the same practice, right? So they've got an N of 5 and they think, well, this is going to be great because it's so good for me. But they don't realize that maybe what works in one part of the country, you go even across the street to a different health system, and it's a completely different situation. So Barbara helps to get folks to think about maybe not only locally or regionally, but scope of practice from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, and how that can be so different.
Another thing that's really helpful to think about is how are you going to market and what do those materials need to look like? Because it's different when you're with a client, a prospective hospital or whatever, or you're going to a conference and you have a booth or you don't have a booth. You only have like these reverse expo summits. And you might have 2 minutes, 3 minutes with someone. What are you going to put in front of people, or what are you going to have as your elevator pitch? And this is where those real key value propositions come in handy. I attend a lot of those as a sort of a ear. I go around and listen, and I like to see my friends in the booths and the friends, lined up and things. But I listen. And you can tell when the eyes glaze over, and you can tell with, hey, I've been looking for a product like that. Here's my card. Give me a call. I'll get in touch with you. So there's a lot of ways to really co-opt what the learning is about your value, because you're going to use it in so many different types of situations.
And one of the things, for our listeners who are listening regularly to us, right? We just last podcast interviewed somebody who talked about landscape and landscape analysis. And I'm just wondering, what's the difference between the landscape analysis and the value analysis?
Well, before we tapped into some landscape assessment folks, the value analysis, so like me, I would try to do it all. And I'd be out there looking at data from all the different comparable companies, and I'd be diving into this and that. And pretty soon my engagements wound up being very long because I need some of that information to do the other work that I do, so that then in this market, there are 16 different, companies. And 12 of them are pretty viable. And these 3 are the ones that really match up most closely and that sort of thing. If I really want to get after the true value, I'm going to take that, but I'm going to dig further into other pieces of all that. So I'm going to really look at more of the clinical or even non-clinical aspects that from those companies that are going to bring that value, versus having to do all that research into every competitor and things. I just want a list of what they are, and then I'm going to dig into certain things that the landscape doesn't bring you.
Yeah, so I think you're getting, for lack of a better word, you're getting dirty, meaning you're getting at granular level, right? You're on the ground. What is going on in the mind of that nurse, if it's a nurse product? How is that going to impact that CFO, right, at that level, correct?
Right. I do a bunch of persona type value statements as well, depending on who you're going to talk to and where your product is. Every one of the personas listen differently and need different information at different times. I have sort of a worst case scenario is I worked with a supplier a couple years ago and worked with some of the sales folks. And a couple of them said, well, I only work with the CEO, so I really don't need to listen to these things. And I go, when you go to the CEO, guess who they pick up the phone or send an email to once you leave? Value analysis. They go, can you go talk to them because they were in here pitching something, but it's really more in the wheelhouse of you and your team. And can you do that for me and stuff? So I've done a lot of those CEO giving me the lowdown and say, please take care of this. So you've got to learn it no matter where in your supplier organization you are. You need to learn what are some key elements in order to sell. And one of them in now more than ever is those value. It's not just the price, it's total value.
And Mike, the learning happens when you see companies make errors. And Barbara and I, about a year ago, worked with a company that was in a rush to get to the market. They went out and they bought, several tens of thousands of dollars worth of inventory for a really rather simple product. And rush, rush, rush. We got to get into this. We need the low hanging fruit. We need to create sales. All of those stories, and we kind of made the mistake of going along with that, only to find out that their product was about 3 times higher than anything else in the marketplace. It looked cute, it looked great, but it just, so we put together a sales team, and the sales team, was just went out there and just ran into a brick wall, right?
Wow.
And just it cost a lot of time, a lot of money. Trying to put that sales team together again is going to be almost impossible because they invested a lot of time themselves. So those are the kinds of pitfalls that you can step into if you don't do that landscape assessment and really wonder or really find out what that competition is like and what those prices look like.
So we're coming, this has been fascinating, and I can't believe we're coming to the end of the episode right now. But I would like to ask one last question before we wrap it up that maybe will help folks just speak better or think better about value. So when I'm talking to a clinician, what is going to be value to those people in today's marketplace? And, how should what are the things that I should be focusing in on?
So you have to focus in on basically asking them questions and listening, but you have to know the questions to ask. So if you've got a bedside nurse in, say, a critical care cardiovascular unit, you need to know enough about what's that post, say, procedure work that you're having to do, and know what the parameters they're really looking at, and ask them what are some of the stumbling blocks you have to be successful on a day-to-day basis. And maybe they say, I've got these 3 parts that I always have to put together, and if I don't have all 3 parts, then I got to go run around and look and find things. And they go, well, I think I have something that might be able to help with that. We know that this is a problem, and I have one part that we replace all 3. And sometimes might shock people. We have paid a lot more money to take that kind of waste out to get better outcomes. And as long as when we close that gap, the money that we're spending versus the total quality that dollar amount is worth has the upside to that value equation.
And Mike, I would add that the sales dialogue, especially since COVID, to borrow Barbara's phrase from earlier, is that it's changed so dramatically. Instead of talking features and benefits, we're talking value and outcomes. And that you can only really start to get to by asking questions. So the sales rep that's armed with, all the features and benefits of their product and comes in and starts spewing that off, the clinician's looking at them or the decision maker going, who cares? Right. And you've got to find out really what's driving that, and, ask permission to ask those questions. Right. But the value analysis, the landscape assessment can arm that salesperson, make them look much more professional. And I find when I work with salespeople that we work through this process, it's very interesting, Mike. They become much more calm. They become much more patient. And they because they know what the landscape is. And they're asking the clinician very educated questions that communicate to that clinician or customer, this person knows what they're talking about. They're asking me some good, maybe hard questions, but they're good questions. And it creates a dialogue based on need. And I find sometimes, I work with reps will go in thinking, we're going to be talking about this particular product or project, and you start getting this feedback and you go, wait a minute, they really don't need this, they need that. And you do that pivot, and all of a sudden you see that clinician kind of smile, they lean forward, right? Because now you've really identified that really hot spot for them, and you're solving the problem.
It's funny because, when both of you, the way you both answered the question falls right in line with what I teach. And that is, you can never be a product pusher, right? Because then you are a true salesperson and you wear all the muck that comes with that stereotypical definition, as opposed to being an authority in your space. And an authority or a doctor or, somebody who's looked up to is always going to ask questions before they make a diagnosis or a recommendation. And I think that's what both of you have eloquently said so nicely. So look, it's been great. I think we have to wrap it up. We're getting a little hook here. So Thomas, can you give us last words?
Sure. Last words for me would be talk to Barbara, right? First of all, and pay attention and really take that value discussion to heart, because it can really make a difference for your company and the clinicians and patients that you serve.
Awesome. And Barbara, last words.
And I think I was just going to say, take the time to learn about what actually goes on between the time you have a product and what's the process for every organization, and ask all the right questions.
My final thoughts are, I genuinely enjoyed both of you and your knowledge and sharing it with me and the audience, and I know the audience has appreciated as well. So thank you both. And for those listening, we genuinely appreciate you. We're here to bring you value. Please like and share the podcast with your friends. We want to spread the word and educate everybody. And we thank you again for listening. So this is the Medtech Business Academy, and we'll see you next time.